The intimacy that we have experienced has just been such a gift from NFP. Have there been hard seasons? Absolutely. I don't want to act like it's all just been a breeze. Every 21 months we had another boy. So we did that 4 times. I felt like I had one tip of one nostril sticking up above water. Everything else felt like it was drowning. And it's okay to say, this doesn't feel like enough, and trusting in the Lord and His perfect timing, and kind of learning how to get out of my own way. And we were able to use NFP to postpone having another baby for almost 6 years.
Hi everyone, I'm Viva and welcome to the PeakLife Show. Today I have another very special guest for you. Her name is Rachel Balducci. She is a wife and mother of 6 children. She is also a published author, speaker, and is now getting her PhD. And so this episode is for anyone that is kind of new to NFP. Maybe you've heard a lot of amazing things about it, but Rachel and I really get into what it looks like in practical married life with kids and wrestling with what each season of life might be calling us to, and how she can look back now and be so grateful for the surrender and trust that she had in placing herself in those seasons of life. And so today we are so excited to be able to sit down with Rachel and to share with you guys all the knowledge and wisdom that she has for us. So welcome, Rachel. And this episode today was brought to you by the PeakDay app. Go ahead and download it today and start your free trial. Hi, Rachel. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you and to kind of hear about your personal journey with NFP in your marriage and even in work life, and just kind of hear about your own personal journey and what that has looked like for you and your family. So to start us off, just give us a little bit of detail about who you are and what you do right now, and then we'll kind of back up into how that all came to be.
Sure, great. I'm Rachel Balducci. I'm excited to be here. I'm married to Paul, who's an immigration attorney. We live in Georgia, and we have been married 30 years. We have 6 children, 5 boys, and 4 of our boys are in their 20s now. And then we have our 5th son, Henry, is a junior in high school. And then we have 1 girl at the end. Our daughter, Isabel, is a 9th grader. So that is us. And then what I do, I kind of think of myself like, for many years, when I started back into the workforce, I would say, all the things I do, but really I'm just a mom. And so let me preface it by saying, like, that's the most important gig that I've got going, is being a wife and a mom. So after college, I was a newspaper reporter for a while, and then I got my master's, and then I stayed home and had all these babies. So, we'll get to that. Fast forward, and when my daughter was in elementary school, kind of later in elementary, it was like the Lord totally opened this door for me to start teaching journalism at the local university. But in the meantime, in my years staying home, I started a blog called Testosterone Home. And so I wrote all about the adventures of raising little boys, because at that point I had 4 boys who were within 5 years. And then that led to becoming a columnist for our diocesan newspaper. And then that led to getting some books published. So now I've got 4 books that I've published. And I'm the co-host of The Gist on Catholic TV. And now I teach full-time at Augusta University. And I'm actually just finished my first year in graduate school working on a PhD in religion at the University of Georgia. So I'm very excited about that. I feel like that is kind of taking sort of all the spiritual stuff that I've been writing and talking about. I talk at a lot of retreats and conferences too, and kind of getting some academic experience with all of that. So that's a fun new adventure.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
On so many things. Why?
Yeah, really? I'm just a wife and a mom. That's what,
Yeah, but wife of 30 years, having been a mother for so long, with, you said 5 boys and 1 girl.
Mm-hmm.
So 6 kids, published author, teacher, and now you're getting to dive into your own new adventure later in life, which I'm sure maybe you didn't even see coming. Maybe when you were in your 20s or 30s or first having kids, you probably never would have thought, I'm going to go get my PhD in religion, because why not?
Yeah, exactly. When I got my master's degree, so I got married like 2 months after I finished undergrad, like graduated in June, got married in August. And because, of NFP and our openness to, and we can talk more about this a bit, I kind of like expected that we would have kids sooner than later. I didn't have some grand plan of like 5 years down the road, but it was kind of like babies are going to come and openness to what God wants, kind of coupled with our wit and intellect. So right off the bat, though, before, we had any babies, like we had been married a year and I told my husband, I just want to go get my master's degree, like real quick. So kind of like yeah, exactly. Knocked that out. And then, but when I got it, there were two options. You could either do like a track in the event that you wanted to get a PhD down the road, or there was this other one that was like a more professional approach. And for some reason, I opted for the one that left the door open to getting a PhD, and then it was like 30 years later, I ended up going back. So it was kind of like a little like dream kind of deep down there that I didn't really entertain a lot because for many, many years, it was just completely out of the question. And then for the last 5 years, I had really been praying and seeking God's plan in the midst of that, and doors were not opening. And so it was really neat when the right thing came along. The door just opened, and it was like the right time and the exact right program, and just really encouraging, but a great opportunity in trusting in the Lord and his perfect timing and his perfect plan, and kind of learning how to get out of my own way, which is really a good thing to learn how to do.
Yeah, we all need a little life experience in getting out of our own way. That's for sure. One of the things I want to ask you about is kind of your journey into NFP, natural family planning, because I feel like depending on the generation we grew up in, or even our diocese that we grew up in, or if we didn't grow up Catholic at all, right? If we were converts, whatever it may be, everyone has had their own introduction to natural family planning and what that looked like, also how they felt about it,
Yeah.
right? And kind of the initial, sometimes shock, I think people experience with the church teaching. So, what was your kind of initial start into the whole world of NFP?
So when Paul and I were engaged, we took an NFP class. So we both grew up in families where our parents discovered that at some point within their conversion experience and within their marriage. I grew up with my mom having like the book with the yellow flower on the front, and I had a lot of friends whose parents were in that same boat. So I think that it was very normalized. I wouldn't say that we talked about it a lot necessarily, but there was definitely this understanding of an openness to life and doing this thing called NFP that our parents did. My husband's from a family where he has a sister who is 1 year younger than him. And then 10 years later, his parents had 5 more kids because they had this conversion experience and they started to understand the teachings of the church. And like they had been Catholic, but NFP was not a part of the conversation within their marriage at that point. Once they became open to life in this new way, they added 5 more kids. So my husband is like much older than some of his siblings,
Yeah.
but so he's the oldest of 7, and I'm the oldest of 8. So we definitely like had that understanding of like the beauty of a big family. We have 6 kids. I never really saw myself as someone who I thought would have a big family. And growing up with 8 siblings or one of 8, I don't even see 6 as necessarily all that big,
Yeah.
relatively speaking. But I'm grateful for that because I think I would have seen myself like if it were up to me. And the gift of each baby. Like when our first son was born, I remember Paul saying, if God doesn't bless us with any more babies, this is enough. And I felt that way with each new baby. It felt kind of complete. And maybe sometimes that was wishful thinking too, because I remember when we had our third son and, we have like a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old and a newborn. And I was like, this is a great amount of children, you know?
This is good.
Yeah, we're good. And I'm like, barely staying afloat. So we entered into our marriage with this understanding that we would do it. And over time, I started to understand the gift of it, much more. So
Right.
it was a gift. And I feel like the Lord really honored our obedience by one, helping us to understand it, and then really giving us the gift of this family that I think, again, if I had just picked and like got to pick and choose, on a calendar over the course of 20 years, it would not have looked like what we did.
Yeah.
And it's so wonderful the way it worked out. Have there been hard seasons? Absolutely. Like I don't want to act like it's all just been a breeze. Like one thing I love to joke about, and I've written about this, is like when our fourth son, August, was born, I felt like I had one tip of one nostril sticking up above water. Everything else felt like it was drowning, you know? So, and I'll tell you what happened is after that fourth boy was born, I went and started meeting regularly with an NFP instructor. Like I set
Mm.
it up like on a every couple of months basis, because what happened is we had been kind of winging it, I think initially. It's not really a poor reflection on NFP as, whatever you want to use it for within your marriage, to achieve pregnancy, to postpone pregnancy. For us, we weren't really as hyper committed to really using the rules properly to postpone
Right.
pregnancy. And so we had babies, and that was
Yeah.
great. And then after that fourth son was born, I really was like, I can't keep doing this, because each boy was every 21 months we had another boy. So we did that
Wow.
4 times. So after the fourth son, my husband and I realized like we really needed to have some space, and I thought at that point maybe even to be done, when
Yeah.
we prayerfully consider. So I got really committed to understanding the method. I met with an instructor regularly, and we were able to use NFP to postpone having another baby for almost 6 years. And then believe it or not, like when that youngest hit 3, I started to kind of get my wits about me after many years of having either a newborn and a toddler.
Yeah.
And then when he was 5, I was like, I don't know that I'm ready to be done, adding members to our family. So we thought we would have like one last baby, because at that point I was in my mid 30s, so it was already considered like advanced maternal age.
Yeah.
Yeah, geriatric pregnancy, which is crazy. Um, so, we added our son Henry, and then 2 years later we had like one last surprise, pregnancy slash
Yeah.
baby, which was Isabel, and it was wonderful. So I think the thing with NFP that can be a real challenge is we walk in such trust. We're trusting in the Lord's plan, but we're working again with Him. Like I really like that focus of like using our wit and intellect. Like NFP doesn't mean you better just be ready to have as many babies as come along.
Right.
Some people feel called to have that understanding within their marriage, but
Mm-hmm.
that's not what NFP is about. And so what it does though is it never sort of permanently closes the door on anything. And what Paul and I realized is we were in constant communication with this like unitive aspect within our marriage, which is having sex yields babies. And I think
Yes.
it's a false understanding to think that those two are like separate things.
Right. Right.
It was a gift, and I'm able to sing its praises, NFP's praises, in hindsight, now that it's been many years since I've had to chart or anything like that. But that for those couples that are walking through it now and they feel the strain of it, that I would encourage them, like, it is a beautiful gift, but you also grow in a lot of trust with the Lord,
Right.
and you also have hard times where you're like, Lord, why do you keep, I feel stretched past what I can do. And then again, for us, when we really got to that point, we figured out how to, like, I really became somebody that was studying the art of this to really understand how to make it work, within our marriage in a good way.
Yeah. I mean, the church calls us to real discernment with our spouse, right? Every month, especially for us young couples using NFP, you're right. Like, it doesn't come without strain. It doesn't come without certain stressors or feeling like, especially for us women in times of our cycle, and if we are trying to postpone, we're like, man, we would love to be intimate with our husband right now. And yet we can't, because this is where our discernment is. And that is not easy, but it feels so reassuring to have someone on the other end of the spectrum who has been there, done that, say it's okay for it to be hard and it's okay for it to cause maybe a little tension and stress, because you working together with your spouse through that brings such a good fruit, because we are in constant communication with each other. We're in constant communication with the Lord, and growth doesn't happen without being pulled and stretched and challenged and being able to kind of overcome those challenges within our marriages, and to view, like you said, each child as a gift just for who they are in and of themselves. And that at the end of our life, when we look back, it's nothing like we would have planned ourselves. And we're so grateful for it. I mean, I feel that way now. I'm only 28 and I look back at these past 8 years, since I was 20, like, oh my goodness, thank goodness that it didn't go as planned as 20-year-old Viva wanted.
Yes.
Because if that was the case, I wouldn't be married yet for another couple years,
Totally. I feel the same way. And I love that point, like that openness to, having a plan and using the gifts God has given you, but also being open to the doors that God is opening and
Right.
really being prayerful. Because I felt the same way, getting married at 22, that was not my plan. I was not somebody that, had been like planning my wedding and really, yeah. And really had this timeline that was more like 25 or 26.
Right.
And then, what happened for me is dating and falling in love with a man who was 8 years older than me, already done law school, and it was kind of like, it doesn't make sense to put off getting married just because it doesn't match a number that I picked for myself,
Right, right. One of the terms you've used a couple times is being open to life. And I think for a lot of us Catholics, we kind of have a good understanding of what that looks like. But could you explain what that looks like in, I guess, in reality, in practice? What does it mean to be truly open to life and to allow those doors to be open?
Sure. So when I think about like an openness to life, I'm always going to go back to my primary vocation. So my primary vocation, I see it as being a wife and a mom. This idea of an openness to life, I think, like at its most basic, as a wife, I would, and as a married woman, this idea of like prayerfully considering God sending us a baby, being open to getting pregnant again, and what does that look like? And kind of not living in this space where we have a plan in advance that we're not open to hearing from God. Again, like if when Paul and I got married, if we had just said we're having 2 kids and then he's going to go deal with some stuff and then that's going to be the end of it, that is not an openness to life. In a bigger scale now, like as somebody who's past the years of being able to get pregnant, and I'm like not sad about that, for people who think like life's over at a certain age, it's like, wow, that was a wonderful season. And now we're in this other season and it's wonderful. Does openness to life continue? Well, what does that mean? And I think it's just, this idea of like living the life that God has called you to live, taking care of the people that he puts in your path. For me, priority wise, it's husband and children. My mom died a few months ago. She lived next door to us. My dad died 2 years before that. And so for the last 2 years, one of my priorities became caring for my mom,
Yeah.
and then in the last 6 months of her life, like her health really became a full-time situation for us. I knew I couldn't live at that pace indefinitely, but in that, whatever the season was, it was like, I'm prioritizing my husband and kids, but really my mom is becoming the priority. I can't do this forever, but I can do it for right now, And so I
Right.
really think like an openness to life it really is just like an openness to the voice of God, to me. And I end up talking about this, it always goes back to prayer. Like the answer
Mhm.
to all of these things, how do I, for me, how did I know that God was like kind of drawing me towards this PhD program? Well, or how did I know like how to manage things with my mom, or like it's being in tune, I think, with the Holy Spirit. And the only way we can do that is if we have a real relationship of prayer that happens on a daily basis, so
Yeah.
that, we don't necessarily sit down in prayer and hear God audibly talk. But when we are spending time in an intimate friendship relationship with God, we are sensitive to his leadings. And I think that that's great, that openness to life in that season and what that looks like as a young wife, as a young mom, and through the years, how that shifts.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that, especially in the way you did, because even I haven't heard it really explained as in reality that can look like just being openness to what the Lord has for you in that season. When you're a young wife and mother, that might be an openness to life with more babies, or even an openness to God putting a pause on that for you for a while. If you're going through health stuff, whatever that looks like. And I love that you talked about that transition into we get older as a woman and we're no longer able to conceive and carry children. But what does openness to life still look like? It reminds me of, the topic of chastity. Like people think chastity is just about not having sex before marriage kind of thing. When in reality, you're still called to practice chastity within your marriage, right? And chastity covers so many other aspects of our spiritual life and our relationships with people, just like how being open to life is really an openness to the Holy Spirit's movement in your life. What is He prompting you to in this season? And being open to listen and accept what that might look like. I love, love, love that perspective. One of the things that you touched on a little bit earlier that kind of hit close to home for me was I could have done all the things I'm doing now as a young wife and mother, being in the throes of parenthood. But could I have done it peacefully? Would it have brought me peace at the time? No. Can you talk a little bit into that? Because so many women sometimes are afraid of having more kids, or sometimes they do want to step out of the workforce to be home with their kids, and they might feel some shame with that, like, oh, I'm supposed to be able to kind of do it all kind of thing. But I loved, yeah, you just talking about, but is there peace?
Yeah.
And when the time is right, there will be peace. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think peace is the name of the game. Like once I have worked through some kind of bumpy times in my life, and I'll
Right.
share about that in a moment. But I'm always kind of like going after peace, and we have to work for it. And so, okay, I'll start by giving a little word picture, and I think this is something that is a familiar image to us, but it's so great to operate out of this idea of like having a jar and having bigger rocks and then smaller rocks and then pebbles and then gravel. If you put the gravel in first and then you try to put the next biggest thing in and then you put the bigger rocks at the very end, it's not going to fit properly. If you put the bigger rocks in the jar first and then the next size down and then the pebbles and then you fill it in with the sand, it all fits. And so it's first things first, right? So when I'm prioritizing what I see as my priority. And for me, my priorities are, husband and children and spending time with the Lord and then work and then looking to see what I can peacefully add after that. I think what's so beautiful about like God's relationship with man is that he relates to each one of us individually. There's not a one size fits all. And I found the most peace when I quit looking around at what other women in particular were doing to see if I was doing it right. The hardest seasons that I've been in and I had a couple of really big times in my life where I had to learn this the hard way, is when I was saying yes to things because of insecurities in my own life, a fear of getting left in the dust, a fear of life passing me by, looking around and saying, if I don't say yes to this now, I'm never going to get this chance again. So I would say yes to things and I would compare myself to other women that were doing things. I'll give you an example. For several years, I was basically like a full-time volunteer at my kids' school, and I ended up teaching 4 classes and running all these different things. And I was doing it because I felt like life was passing me by. Now, it ended up being like for several years, it was good, but all of a sudden, it was like I hit this one year and it was time for me to not do it. And I kept pushing through because I was afraid of missing out on something. And it was like the grace was gone. And halfway through the school year, I had to walk away from teaching. And it was very embarrassing. It's really embarrassing to quit something like that halfway through. But what was happening is it was depleting me so much that I wasn't available for my husband. My kids were getting like my second best energy or something. That was out of order. And so that kind of is like that idea of peace being the name of the game. And then really for me, I had to start looking at my identity. How do I see myself? That had to come from my relationship with God and not from what I did. And I was seeking my identity from using the gifts God had given me, and it was getting me into trouble, because I was
Yeah.
saying yes to a lot of things to feel good about what I was doing with my time. And really that wasn't what God wanted for me right then.
Right. Your years of motherhood, the way you started your blog, Testosterone, which I want to talk about. I love that. And then being able to write a little bit more and then teach journalism. And then that escalates into being a published author. I know your kids, some of your kids are graduated and you're at this point of life where this has all come to a head and you getting a PhD and just the beauty of being able to live in the present moment and accept the gifts God is giving you then, because that obedience, like you said in the very beginning, has been rewarded. You didn't know how it was going to be rewarded, and many of us aren't going to know until 20, 30 years down the line. But to trust that that obedience will be rewarded, I think is something all of us, myself included, need to take home and write down, remember, because yeah, you're just such a good reminder of what that can look like.
Oh, thanks. I'm thinking of like two different passages, one scripture and then one quote that all of us love by Catherine of Siena. I'll start with her. Be who you were created to be, and you will set the world on fire. And
Yes.
there are so many different parts of us that God, created us to be. And I think sometimes it's really easy when you have little kids to think that doesn't count for anything. You know, like
Mm,
like this idea of like I was created for more than this. Yeah, but right now this is what God's got you doing, and you were created for this, and you were also created for something else 10 years from now and 20 years from now,
yeah.
and it's all going to be beautiful together. And it might be, I remember when Isabel was 1 years old, had just turned one, and that was my very first speaking engagement. I flew to Boston and I spoke at this thing called Mom's Day Away, which my friend Danielle Bean had organized. And I remember feeling like this was ridiculous, but is a mom allowed to fly on an airplane by herself? Because my mom had never done anything like that. It was so like, and I knew that was dumb. Like I didn't say it out
Yeah.
loud because I'm
Yeah.
like, that's a dumb thought. But also in my mind, it was like it didn't compute. I felt all this guilt, but the Lord had opened the door for me to go do this thing. And that started like opening other opportunities for me. That was the beginning of it, but it felt a little bit sooner than I would have thought, with Isa being, she had just turned one.
Right.
That was God's time, and I had to trust even though it was scary. So the point of all of this is we really just have to be in tune with the Holy Spirit, because if we're so stuck on the timeline, something being too soon or something not being soon enough, those are both equally problematic in our thinking. And so I love that, be who God has created you to be, and you'll set the world on fire. And sometimes that means in your own little kitchen making
Mm,
dinner and getting people in bed and feeling like you just ran a marathon, like you made it. What a great feeling.
yeah.
That's setting the world on fire. And then the other scripture that I love, the scripture that I love is Jeremiah, behold the plans I have for you, says the Lord, and there are plans of good to do good. And I'm not quoting it right at all, but this idea of like a future of hope and fulfillment. And we have to trust that. And we are going to have seasons where we don't feel like we're living to our potential. Or
Hmm.
like for me, I remember a neighbor saying to me that he called it the abundant life. Like this season when we added Henry, I thought that was just going to be so easy. A little baby after a 6-year gap, and I didn't have any little kids anymore, which cracks me up because now looking back, I'm like, I had a 5-year-old, 7-year-old, 9-year-old, and 11-year-old. But I
You're
felt like
like, you guys are all grown men.
compared to what I had done the last
Yeah.
one, that kicked my butt so hard. And then to have this surprise pregnancy. And then I really, what I did in that season of Viva is I just surrendered. Like,
Mm,
and that's where the real work for me of like a deeper conversion with the Lord started to happen, because I literally was like, forget it. I don't know what's what. I'm hanging on by a thread. I remember when I had Henry, his birthday is in the dead middle of the summer, and I was at the pool because I have all these little, these boys. And my friend Molly was giving birth a week later, 2 weeks later, and she saw me and I looked so terrible. She said, it scared her because she knew she was about to do the thing that I had just done that made me look that bad, which was give birth to a baby. So, it's like sometimes life is almost too full, the abundant life, and then
yeah.
sometimes you have these moments where you just feel like and I see this a lot. And I think this is, a common tension that women experience, which is I feel like I'm bursting inside and I have more to offer. Where are the opportunities? Like, and it's okay to say, this doesn't feel like enough. You can tell that to the Lord, like raising these babies, keeping my house clean, cooking the next meal. I'm like, how many loads of white towels am I going to fold in my lifetime? A lot. I think about this. And sometimes it can feel like drudgery. And it's
Mhm.
okay to tell the Lord that. I think for some women, it might be that you really need an outside thing sooner than other women. For me, I felt like survival was just the name of the game for me. And then little
Mhm.
by little, other opportunities arose. But again, peace and priority and recognizing, first things first. And the last thing I'll say about this is, we can't compare what other people are doing. And again, I mentioned that when I was working at the school, I was looking at what other women seemed to be able to do in terms of the amount of time that they volunteered. And I tried to keep up with that. And not because I wanted to be as good or better than them, but I felt like that must be the standard that I need to hold myself to.
Right. Shouldn't I also be able to do this thing?
That's
Yeah.
right. Exactly. And you alluded to that earlier too. And I think that's where like we're only going to get peace. We can be inspired by other people, but comparison is the thief of joy.
Yeah.
And the minute you start looking at what other women are doing, and don't use social media to be a gauge of anything, because you might see somebody's beautiful little corner of their house and the rest is like a dumpster fire, and what it costs somebody to do what they're doing might be worth it to them, and it might absolutely not be worth it for you, and
Yeah.
we all have the freedom to figure that out.
Yeah. I really appreciate what you said about giving yourself the freedom to be honest with the Lord with where you're at. Which is funny because he already knows. He
Yeah.
already knows everything we're thinking. He already knows what we're wrestling with in our hearts on the inside. But there is freedom, and even telling like a trusted friend or your spouse, like, I love this life, but something feels missing, or feeling like, God, this is maybe too much. Like, how can I scale back?
Yeah, I remember being at this point with our little boys, and among my group of friends, and again, this was many years ago, but nobody was sending their kids to preschool. And I was finding myself exhausted at the end of the day, very little spacing between my kids. I had a husband, who would work these long hours. So I grew up, my dad was the headmaster of the private school that I went to. So he was home by like 4, or we would ride
Yeah.
home from school with him, and then he might have a meeting in the evening. But my understanding of like what a dad life looked like in the afternoon was very different than being married, to somebody who was working until the earliest 6 o'clock, more like 6:30 or 7. And
Wow.
so I realized that the break that I was going to get was not when my husband walked in the door at 4 p.m. to take the babies. It was going to be like I was going to do preschool. And so,
Mhm.
from 9 to 1, I would get this little break that nobody else seemed to need. That was really hard for me because I was comparing myself, and it made me feel like a wimp. Like, well, nobody else seems to need their kids gone for a few hours.
Yeah.
And then getting to this point where it's like, am I in unity with my husband on this? Like, that's what matters. We have to do what's best for us and for our family. And we can't compare. And again, it took me a while to realize, oh, one of the reasons that it doesn't seem to there's not that same need is these are women. And I remember driving through the neighborhood one evening or one afternoon, and it was like all these husbands were already home at 5:30, and my husband wasn't going to be home for another at least an hour. And that was good for me because all of a sudden I realized we're all living different lives,
Yeah.
and like, even if somebody you were to decide that homeschooling doesn't work for you, it's like you don't even have to have a grand excuse other than we're going to do what works best for us, and we're finding a lot of peace in doing this other thing, or
Yeah.
we like to say the grace has worn off, or whatever that is. And again, what's beautiful is you can get wisdom. Like, I really have appreciated the we've had some great mentor couples over the years. Paul and I both had very strong parents who offered us a lot of wisdom, but
Mhm.
also other couples that were like 10 years ahead of us. And so we could get wisdom from them. And that was good. And to have kind of accountability. But ultimately, you have to just make the decisions and do what's best for you. And I mean, and I have very close friends and we do things totally different. And that's
Yeah.
great. One's not right and one's not wrong. It's just like what works best for our family and the temperaments of the people that God put in our family.
Yes, yes. And that all circles back too to like just family planning, NFP discernment, and knowing that what is happening in your family life is between you and your husband and the Lord,
Yeah.
and to be able to make those decisions with confidence. Because that reminds me of there's a quote from JP2, him talking about when he was giving spiritual direction, always saying, well, you must choose. At the end of the day, you must choose, you must decide. You can't discern forever, right? I think there's just really something to be said about whether you're choosing daycare or school options for your kids, things that feel at the time kind of like life and death and very like, oh, well, they're doing something different than me. And does that make me bad or a failure that I can't hang, I kind of need this little break sort of thing, to fill up my own cup as a mom.
Yeah, I love that too. And I think being inspired, like when you surround yourself by other couples and families that have similar goals, like I felt like Paul and I were so lucky because we had this group of friends and we were all doing NFP together, not together, but we were all doing it.
Yeah.
We could complain about it and
Yes.
we could talk about the challenges. Like I think that there's like this false sense of like, if you're doing NFP, it's because you love it and it's the easiest thing ever and you just think it's fabulous. It's like there's a lot about it that's challenging. And so
Yeah.
we felt really blessed to have other couples that were walking the same path as us. Some of whom,
Hmm.
our very dear friends have 8 kids, and then we've got some, that have smaller families, and we're all kind of like we're all doing what God has asked us to do, given us the life that he's given us to live. And that's a beautiful thing, but also just to be real about it too. It's okay. And again, getting back to this idea of like a conversation with God, I remember those times when you're like, it kind of feels like a ripoff that the one time a month that I'm totally wanting to do this thing, if I don't want to have a baby, it's like not available
Nope.
for me to do.
Yeah.
Like where's the wisdom in that? Well, you fast forward a few years and that season is behind you. And it's crazy to think that we ever kind of lived at that level. But it was a
Hmm.
gift, because learning to and I remember the instructors would always be like finding other ways to show that you love each other. And it would, yeah, you're like, um, but once you get to a season where there's not these set times where, your sexuality is not available, there is a gift to learning how to communicate with your spouse.
Right.
Like you're speaking about the most intimate part of your life, and to have the communication tools to talk about that. I think a lot of couples, if you don't use NFP, I think sex becomes just a given for women, especially because we have this need to be cherished in a way that's different than men. There's a beauty in not necessarily just being like available all the time, and not in a like a manipulative way, but like that there are other facets to this part of our life, this love life that we have, that don't just involve having sex and then moving
Right.
on, never talking about it, and never having discussions.
Right.
There is a lot about it that's beautiful, but for those people that are in the trenches and you're like, seriously, I'm here to say I also was in that boat too. And then as time goes on, you do recognize the gift of it. You
Yeah.
will get to a place. But I'm so grateful that God dreamed bigger than I ever could. I'm so grateful.
Shifting gears just a little bit here before we end, what would you say, because you're a speaker and I'm sure you encounter other women too that aren't just like in the Catholic realm of the world, right? What would you say to people who are kind of curious about natural family planning, but maybe have their own ideas of it or seem reluctant or hesitant, or maybe just have never heard of it before, right? How would you, in your own words, kind of describe NFP, what it is?
Well, I think I would start right off the bat by saying it's not the rhythm method. And I think so many people, if they don't understand, I literally heard somebody I was sitting in one of my classes for, my PhD program, and they were talking about like things Catholics believe. Somebody referred to it as the rhythm method, because it was like me in a room full of like these 22 and 23-year-olds, but they all knew I had 6 kids. I'm like, I'm I'm not going to take this moment to be the expert on this right now. I just kind of let it, be.
Hmm.
But like right off the bat, I would explain to people that there is a lot of science that goes into this. And, a lot of times if you look to families that have lots of babies and you think that that's not the best advertise, that's not the best marketing for this thing, it's
Yeah.
usually because those families are at peace with an openness to life and also get to this place where they recognize the gift of babies being added to their life, but that there are people who use it, like if you really for whatever reason feel called to have two or three children, to really limit the size of your family, that it can be effective for that. And I think the other thing, and it's kind of like what we were just talking about, is the benefit within marriage of having these kind of communication skills, these tools, and just kind of what it's done for our marriage. The intimacy that we have experienced in communication, but in our life in general, has just been such a gift from NFP. So that's kind of how I would explain it right off the bat. Is it's not the rhythm method. There's a lot of science to it. There's a lot of different approaches to it, different methods that seem to work more effectively for other people.
Yeah.
And that you really can find something that works well for you. And that's really, it's a beautiful gift.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I have a lot of friends who are healthcare professionals who say that they don't learn any of this in medical school, in nursing school. Like women's bodies, reproductive health is not discussed because there's medication for it. And so it's like a thing you don't need to understand. It's really incredible to understand all that goes on with fertility and just a woman's body in general, like
Hmm.
to know that there is this thing called a cycle, and it's more than just like having a period and then waiting for your period to come again, like there's a
Right.
lot more to it. And I
How much
think
that happens in between.
there's a lot going on. Yes. And so it's like the opportunity to learn that, because I think NFP is like the place that that's being discussed,
Yeah.
and not in a feminist way. And I know that's a bit of a trend, is talking about, what a bummer it is to have a period or whatever, this like, new conversations about a real openness to talking about what goes on with women, but it's still at a very basic level. And like
Hmm.
with NFP, it's really diving into the understanding. And I think, golly, for a society that wants science in so many different places, I think NFP, understanding your fertility would be a really welcome place to be having that conversation as well.
Right.
So,
Like why wouldn't we want our junior high and high school girls who are experiencing their period to understand what is actually going on? What are the mechanisms happening? And you're not crazy for feeling really sad on a Tuesday. It's just this is where you're at in your cycle, honey.
yeah,
Like that's okay. And we all go through it and it's normal.
yeah.
And for young girls to be able to have even that openness and conversation with their mothers or healthcare providers, to find out, okay, well, they are having cycle issues. So what are some other things we can do to help our young girls that are not just giving them the pill? I think in your case too, having raised so many young boys, which we could do a whole hour podcast on that probably, um, and giving them in a way the knowledge too, just having seen their parents practice NFP and that openness to life there, the knowledge of, yeah, this is how a woman's body works and it's beautiful and it's sacred. But giving people the why and the science behind it so that men can be turned off to the idea of NFP. It sounds like a lot of work, but when you understand, or if you grew up with an understanding of it, how much more open you are to being able to work with your spouse in this.
Yeah, that awareness is so important, and just, encouraging that conversation, I think is really good. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Rachel, I feel like we could just keep talking to you about so many things. But I just want to say thank you so much for imparting so much wisdom on us. I really feel like every woman, no matter her stage in life, is going to glean some glimmer of hope or feel like I've felt that way too at a certain point of life. And so thank you so much for your vulnerability, your honesty, and just sharing with us your journey of NFP and womanhood and motherhood and how you have just kind of trusted God through the ebbs and flows in your journey. Because I think we all need to be able to relate to each other in that way. So thanks for giving us an opportunity to open that conversation.
Wonderful. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Rachel Balducci, and I just want to encourage all of you out there to give NFP a try. There are apps like PeakDay and other technology that make NFP so easy to use.